Okay, so thanks, girls. I think it's probably as I sat and put this presentation together, I was just, looking at the sheer volume of it. And I'm going to send you notes, so don't feel like you've got to take any notes now. Just try and absorb what I'm saying in terms of, whether it brings up stuff for you to ask questions about and whether it makes sense to you, and then we can always deal with that stuff. But the actual detail of it, I will send you notes. And it's, it's a decent amount of work, and I've really just pulled out the basics and the important things as I see them. So I think essentially what I want to deal with tonight is to just break down. We know the macronutrients are proteins, fats, and carbs. But, there's a lot more to it than just that. And you already know, because I sent you the Noakes traffic light list, that your greens are the foods that he recommends, or that any keto diet would recommend. Oranges are somewhere in between, so they would work for your higher carb days. And then reds are strictly foods that one should aim to avoid, but, they come in, they're not going to kill you. They're just not going to be used terribly often. So I want to sort of go to depth around, as I say, the macronutrients, specifically carbohydrates, but we'll look at the others as well. Okay, so coming into the way that carbohydrates are utilized in the body, essentially they're broken down into glucose. And glucose it can cause some major issues in the body. It's a natural thing to have after you eat. Your blood sugar will rise, but that's assuming you're eating a decent meal with a lot of other things, factors that are going to sort of keep it relatively manageable by the body. The problem is where we bring in high levels of very, very fast or rapidly absorbed carbohydrates is where we end up with this very, very high blood sugar response, which the body then has to respond to, because that is essentially what it sees as an emergency, a need for an emergency reaction. Okay, so the amount of glucose in the blood and how rapidly it rises after food is obviously what impacts on our health. You have the pancreas is the organ that secretes insulin, and insulin, basically what happens is you consume a meal, let's say it's a bar of chocolate, and what happens is that your blood sugar rises dramatically because there's so much concentrated sugar in that bar of chocolate, okay, which would act differently if that meal or if that snack was, let's say, an orange or, even a potato or something like that. But in any event, you eat this food, the body then clocks this rising blood sugar and it responds accordingly. The pancreas produces insulin. Insulin is the hormone that gets sent to the blood to pick up all this glucose, and it needs to put it somewhere. So it typically goes off to the liver cells or to the muscle cells, because you've got 3 cell types in the body. Essentially, those 3 cell types are the ones that store your energy. It's either the muscles, it's the fat cells, or it's the liver cells. And those guys are going to be requested. Firstly, it'll be liver cells and muscle cells that insulin will go to, and it'll ask it to take this excess glucose. And by the way, whatever the liver can't take, because it might not be empty, and whatever the cells can't take, because they might not be empty, gets stored as fat, gets converted into fats and then stored in the fat cells. Okay, so that's also the problem with constant high blood sugar. All right, so the task of insulin is to enhance glucose uptake and metabolism in the liver, fat, and muscle cells, and then to obviously bring that blood sugar level back down again to within healthy parameters. And we'll be talking about this concept of glycemic variability. I've mentioned it before, but it's what's your high and what's your low point, and you should squash those 2 points and keep it relatively stable for good health and for low fat storage. Okay, so eventually what can happen if you are consuming a lot of very rapidly released sugar foods, because insulin, what it does is it kind of knocks on the cell doors, and the cells, if they're insulin sensitive, should immediately hear the knock and ask insulin what it wants. But what happens is that if this happens often enough, eventually the cells become deaf to that signal, so they don't actually hear the knock that insulin is giving on the door. And so insulin has to produce more, and pancreas has to produce more and more and more insulin for a louder knock in order for those cells to kind of go, oh, okay, hi, insulin, what do you want? So that's a problem. And that's the thing that we want to avoid, because that's, of course, where we end up with like diabetes issues and other problems arising from that. Okay. Someone's dog. Who's that?
It's mine. Tucci. Stop it.
No, it's fine. It's fine.
Sorry.
Okay, so the downside of carbohydrates. So basically, we've got whole carbs, which are your fruits, vegetables, and grains. All right, so those are naturally occurring whole carbohydrates. They do add fiber. There's a little bit of a debate on fiber, and I'm not going to go into it tonight because actually it's a very interesting debate, but we've got, and I think I mentioned that we've got this sort of carnivore code, Paul Saladino arguing for much more animal protein, much less plant material because of these anti-nutrients supplied by plants. And he goes into a lot of detail around fiber and why, fiber is not actually a big issue for bowel movements, for the health of the large intestine. So it's very interesting reading, and I think I've included it in the notes that I'm going to give you. And yes, of course, nutrients, you've got some beneficial nutrients coming in. And again, Saladino would argue that those nutrients also carry with them anti-nutrients. So it's a kind of, I think it's really down to how sensitive you are. And if you don't react terribly to food, to vegetables per se, then you're good to go. Some people just react quite strongly to certain foods, and then those are the foods that really should be looked at and maybe taken out of the diet. So unless you know you're particularly sensitive to something, I'm not sure that I would be too concerned about, because you could go to so many different levels with this stuff, and you can get yourself tied in knots. Okay, so you want to eat those things with caution, and you'll know according to the green, orange, and red. Some sit on the red, some sit on the orange, some sit on the green in terms of whole carbohydrate foods. So just because they are a food that is grown in the ground doesn't mean that they are ideal to eat. Processed carbs we know are problematic because they're just full of crap basically, and they don't really contribute to anything. So we're going to eat, if we eat them for taste. It's really just going to be about those bliss moments where we just really enjoy the taste of it. Above ground vegetables and berries are kind of best choices all around because they're relatively low in carbohydrates. So you can always choose those for like your fruit choices, for example, if you wanted fruit. And then you can see some of the side effects. Obviously, diabetes is one of those, cardiovascular disease is another, when you go too high in carbs over a prolonged period of time. So grains, I'm not suggesting you take them all out of your diet. I'm just suggesting that you reduce the proportion that they represent in your diet. Okay. They are quite nice to bring in every now and then. And as I said to you, I tend to eat starches in the evenings, and quite often that's rice. And actually quite often it's white rice. And we can talk about retrograded starches. So if you are going to go with processed grains, you might want to choose stone ground flour products, because that's the whole seed or germ cell plus husk that's been ground into a flour, as opposed to the old school kind of white flour refined product. So at least your stone ground is a slightly more whole product. But bear in mind that the smaller, so listen to this before I get into the rest of this. If you were choosing between bread and pasta for a meal, it would be preferential to choose pasta. I'm not condoning either of these, but just hear the logic. Pasta is a much denser foodstuff than bread. Bread's got a lot of air. It's a very aerated product. So what happens is that when you're chewing on pasta, your digestive enzymes have got a lot more work to do before they can access the glucose. Whereas on bread, because it's so light, it's very easily digestible. And the more easily digestible it is, the more accessible it is for the digestive enzymes, the faster it releases sugar into the blood. Okay, whereas, so it'll take your digestive enzymes slower on the pasta than it will on the bread. So then your resulting rise in blood sugar is sort of mediated to or mitigated to some degree. Does that make sense? So in the same way, rolled oats, because we spoke about this, rolled oats would be better than oatmeal. In the same way that even stone ground flour is refined versus having a bowl of rice, or a bowl of kind of wheat berries or something. Okay, so just keep that in mind, because that's I always think that's quite an interesting aspect to the carbs. Mueslis I don't ever really recommend because they're generally quite hard. They're either raw or they're hard, and that's not great in the digestive system itself. And you can see you've got a list of whole grains there, I mean, some of which you probably have never heard of. I remember tasting Camus, which you can actually get from Dis-Chem, which is quite interesting. It's quite nice stuff. And then I think amaranth. I've also made amaranth porridge, and that's quite interesting, sort of looking at some of those more traditional grains in there. Okay, resistant starches. This is where the rice cooking comes in, or actually other types of starch. So non-fiber starches are broken down into sugar in the body, but your resistant starches basically pass through into the large intestines, and that's what we mean by something having fiber in it. Okay. Your resistant starches offer a number of benefits. So you can see here you've got production of fatty acids that provide energy, and that's within the large intestine. A reduction in inflammation that's an obviously highly beneficial aspect to it. A role in preventing colon cancer, inflammatory bowel disease, improved insulin sensitivity. And the thing I think that's most interesting to me, because of my experience on a very, very low carb diet, and I may have spoken about this before, is that when I first started the low carb diet, I went severely low carb. And over a period of time, eventually I became quite constipated, and then started to, when I looked at this aspect of it, realized that I'd eliminated the prebiotic food that serves the probiotics that live in the gut. And so I started bringing in some starches, because that then supplies them with their food that they then can utilize to thrive and flourish, and then that made for a better digestive system. So the resistant starches are quite useful to bring in. And you can see they're in a number of different foods that you could add to meals. You don't have to add them in huge quantities. And you could, and this is where rice comes in for me, and it's why I use rice a fair amount, is because I quite like white rice. There's some debate about brown rice because it still contains the husk. And, if we think about how long white rices have been cooked by humankind, you look at the East and how frequently they eat sushis. And in fact, rice comes in with virtually every meal, traditionally speaking. But I think the reason that they've never really, apart from their lifestyle, from a dietary point of view, they would cook huge pots of rice and then let those pots of rice cool. And that would be something they would help themselves from for every meal. And so that rice has been cooked on first cooking, it's a high sugar release food because it's a high carb food. But if you let these retrograded starches cool down, they actually then, I think we spoke about this previously, they become less, the sugar becomes less accessible. So it's quite nice to bring in some of these. And I believe it's the same with potatoes. If you kind of bake a potato and you let it cool, or I don't think it would work very well for mashes. I think all of them, to some degree, it works. It's not an enormous benefit, but it is some benefit. So, I always think some benefit's better than none. And so if I do cook rice, I just make sure I have enough time to cool it down before I eat it. Okay. So quite interesting on that. And I would, I think given the amount of sushi they eat in the East too, think about it, it's a cooled retrograded starch. And so it's not going to hike blood sugar levels the way it might if it was served warm. Okay, so vegetables in general, you want to cook as close to in their natural state as possible. So light steaming, maybe stir fry because they're still al dente. You could have some raw unless you get very bloated and gassy from them, in which case you could steam them lightly. Grilled, roasted, all of these things. But ideally, the lower the temperature it's cooked in over a longer period, in general for food, the better. Ideally mix it up so that you don't eat the same vegetables every single time you eat vegetables. Just try and bring in a variety so that you bring in different nutrients with that. Fresh vegetable juice. I used to do a lot of juicing, but I would only ever really do 100 mils or so, a very small amount. I mean, I've had clients come to see me and said, no, I juice every day. And then they're talking about, maybe that's half that size, and that's just an enormous amount of sugar. So as much as it's got a lot of nutrients in it, it's actually, Elsner, we were talking about what did you call it? What's your?
Beetle juice.
Beetle juice, which is, I think, beetroot and carrot, which are two of your highest kind of, I mean, they're both brilliant for different reasons, but both of those are below ground vegetables, which makes them very high starch vegetables, which makes them high sugar vegetables. So if I was doing beet and carrot, I would do a very small amount of both, and then I would probably add things like cucumber, because it's very watery. I would add maybe, you've got two very sweet vegetables in there. You just want to add other stuff that will not bring the sugar level up, but that will bring nutrient levels up. So you've got to kind of look at what's on your green list. Yeah, mostly above ground vegetable. I put nightshade veg in just because some people are affected by something called lectins. And that's a whole other topic one can get into. I mean, that just is digging to a much deeper level around this lectin issue. So if you find that you're affected by those particular nightshade vegetables, if you took them out, it would be your best bet. So it's looking at whether or not you're affected by them. And interestingly enough, the pressure cooker apparently reduces, I've not really used a pressure cooker much in my life, but apparently it reduces the lectin content of these key kind of vegetables. So if you think that's an issue for you, then certainly by all means you could try a pressure cooker. Fruits, obviously we know that these days that they are adulterated to some degree in terms of their growing, because they're made for a sweeter palate, and so they're grown to be sweeter. So your lower fructose fruits are that list, and ideally you should eat fruit by itself, just because it does pass through the system very quickly. It's broken down very rapidly and it passes through. So if you sit it on top of a meal, for example, it's going to sit there, break down, cause gas, fermentation. It can be very uncomfortable on top of a meal. And then finally,
sorry, if you have your lunch and then your dinner, can I have then for a snack a fruit?
Yeah, absolutely. And you could do fruit probably with something like a handful of nuts. I find I'm okay with, if I was doing dairy, if I had some full fat or double thick yogurt and I added some fruit into that, I would be okay. So, you could try that. It's just that you don't really want to eat it on top of protein, like animal proteins, because then it really will take its time coming through the system. So yes, you could do that in between meals. Yeah.
Okay. But there's nothing wrong with the snack.
No. If you,
so I only eat now my lunch and my dinner.
Yeah.
I don't eat anything else.
Yeah, no, that's great. So you don't have to have a snack, but if you need a snack, if you consistently need a snack, you may want to look at the amount of fat you're putting in at lunchtime. You sent me your email around what you were eating, and I had suggested to you that I didn't think you were eating enough protein and or fat. So hopefully you've made some adjustments.
Changed today.
Okay. Yeah. So if you're desperately hungry in between, so for example, for me, I had lunch at about 12:30, and then just before I spoke to you, I had an orange, and I'll eat something straight after I've spoken to you. So I wasn't starving, but I knew I would, I was feeling a little bit empty, which is why I had the orange. I do quite well on oranges, despite, being in more keto. I said to you last night that I'm in a higher carb phase right now, but oranges in general are quite filling to me, whereas other fruits aren't. So you can also test yourself and see, which ones work for you and which don't. But you shouldn't be starving and needing a snack. Either you need to bring dinner closer to lunch, or put more fat in your lunch, or otherwise, if you can't bring dinner closer, then that's an ideal time for something to snack. It's just, as I say, it's kind of dependent on meal times and things. Okay, so sugars. So alternatives to sugar like stevia and xylitol or erythritol are probably your best bet. I haven't tried monk fruit, but basically they don't seem to have much of an impact on the pancreas. In other words, even though they taste sweet, they don't cause a sugar response, whereas actually artificial sweeteners do. It's interesting. Artificial sweeteners cause the same sort of reaction, even as it relates just to the taste bud sensation. The body reacts to it. And they are still implicated in weight gain, increased risk of heart disease and diabetes. So, and they often have, the interesting thing about artificial sweeteners is that they often have a bulking agent, which is a sugar. It's in the form of dextrose or maltodextrin. It's just mad. Anyway, raw honey is enzyme rich. It's a beautiful foodstuff, packed with nutrients, but it is a concentrated sugar, so I would just do it in very small quantities if you are a honey lover. And I have a note here that says, you may be horrified to know that much of the research done on weight gain and use of artificial sweeteners was carried out by the agricultural industry, which feeds cattle with sweeteners to promote fatness.
Oh, wow.
So it's just mind-blowing. It's just mad. All right, so then we leave carbohydrates behind. Any particular questions on that group? I'm going to give you the notes. You can go through those. If you have anything you need to ask, you can always send me an email. And moving to dairy. So we are now looking at obviously using full cream dairy, because when you take the fat out of dairy, so dairy has all three macronutrients in it: protein, fat, and carb. And depending on the kind of dairy, it'll either be less or more protein, less or more fat. When you take the fat out of dairy, you're left with much more lactose, which is milk sugar, than you are left with protein, for example. And so you change something that was once a more balanced foodstuff into a high sugar foodstuff. So, that begs the question, what on earth was the diet food industry doing by promoting low-fat dairy, or low-fat anything, frankly, because fat is the one thing that saves you from overeating, and in particular, overeating carbs. So, go figure. Anyway. So milk and yogurt are relatively high in carb, those two, because they're quite milky products, okay? So milk is a moderate protein, nothing too great, whereas yogurt is slightly higher in protein. Cheeses can range depending on the cheese. They can be low to moderate protein. Cream obviously is more fat than anything else. Butter is more fat than anything else. And they're both low in carb. Those two. Organic grass-fed dairy is your best bet. Now, that's quite hard to find in South Africa. I'm trying to think if I ever saw it. You're more likely to find it around Joburg and Cape Town than elsewhere. Woolies sometimes have the organic. They have organic milk from time to time. They have organic. Actually, they don't. Yeah, they do organic yogurt, don't they? But I think they only do a low-fat. Ugh. So it's not that readily available in South Africa, unfortunately. But you want grass-fed, because when a cattle is grass-fed, their milk is then high in omega-3, because they produce omega-3 from the grasses. So you're then consuming a very, very nice foodstuff. Okay. Also, your organic grass-fed will ensure that you don't have that residual. Personally, I wouldn't touch non-organic milk products, because you've got a huge amount of antibiotic residue in those, in standard feedlot dairy, the heavy dairy producers. They generally have those cows on very high levels of hormones and antibiotics, so that they are constantly producing enormous amounts of milk. All right, what else can we look at? I personally, okay, so this is a tricky one because in South Africa, aspects of certain municipalities in South Africa have made raw dairy illegal. Here you can buy it. In London you can buy, if you just know where to look for it, you can buy it. But generally speaking, you should be looking at raw, high quality, raw, unpasteurized dairy, because pasteurization kills your nutrients. Think about breast milk. It's breast milk for cows. It's the same as our breast milk. It would be like taking breast milk and then boiling it and giving it to an infant. You wouldn't do it. The whole point to breastfeeding an infant is that you give it protection from all sorts of things. You build an immunity from it because it has beneficial bacteria in it. So it sets a child's beneficial bacteria in the gut. So why we would boil, there are historical reasons we initially did pasteurize, and I think that's because I think dairy was initially stored in wooden caskets, and that becomes quite infested. And also, I don't think, I think when they were feeding, when they were looking at cows in city centers, when we're talking a good few hundred years ago, the quality of the milk was fairly poor, I think, in general. And this is from big city. My understanding of big city feeding of feedlot dairy is that they gave the cows the hops from the brewery. It was probably very poor quality. The cows are probably highly stressed, packed together in small spaces, no green pasture. So I think there's a history there, but certainly we don't have the same issues now, and our standards for dairy are much higher. So I wouldn't be buying raw dairy from someone who, has a cow in their backyard and doesn't look like the healthiest character. But certainly I've come across, even in Port Elizabeth, some, used to be able to access very, very high quality raw milk and milk products, cheeses. Have either of you heard of Wisteria Farm with Melanie Falker? Because she used to sell some lovely products. Permaculture Farm. I'm not sure what's happening with her, if she's still going, but maybe just scribble that note down. And it's Wisteria, I think it's W-A-S-T, or is it, it's not W-I-S, I don't think. But just have a look up Wisteria Farm. It's either W-A or W-I or W-E, I don't know. Wisteria Farm, and it's in the Elands River Valley. So yeah, that's something to have a think about. Milk proteins. This is quite an interesting aspect of dairy, is that your two primary ones. Jenny, did you want to ask something?
No.
Oh, okay. Two primary proteins are casein and whey. And casein makes up around 80% of milk proteins. You've got different types of protein within casein itself. And beta casein is one of the larger kind of components of it, with two variants, the A1 and A2. So most of the milk that you'll find in store today is A1, but that can be very problematic for a lot of people who are lactose intolerant. And by the way, people tend to become lactose intolerant, I think often because the milk they're buying has no lactase in it. And lactase is the enzyme that helps you break down lactose. Because it's been pasteurized, it kills the lactase. So you're drinking a product, you don't have the antidote for it, and so you react to it. So if you can find A2 milk, that's slightly better because it's closer to human breast milk. And I've noted the cows down here, but I don't know again what our options are in South Africa. I've never seen buffalo milk. I have had goat milk. And again, Woolworths sell goat milk. It's actually it's a decent goat milk because it doesn't have that pongy flavor. You can get different kinds of goat milk, and frankly, that goaty smell is just too much for me. So you could think about trying to see if you can source A2 milk. And if you go to a farmer's market and they've got milk there, you might ask the question. They might just happen to have A2 milk. I don't know. Okay, so going on to beverages. Soft drinks wise, I think that it's best to avoid, as you know, fizzy drinks and soft drinks. They're just packed with carbs and again, it's just sugar. It's just sugar. So my tendency is to do sparkling water with some squeezed lemon or orange or something in it, or a little bit of fruit juice. I always used to love doing one of the Tizers and sparkling water, so it had a little bit of a flavor with a whole lot of sparkling water, which I thought was quite a nice sort of social soft drink. Sorry, there's a frog again. And then homemade iced tea is always nice. If you can use your stevia or erythritol or xylitol, just make it with rooibos. So make it hot, add your sugar, and then you can throw in some lemon or orange juice, cool it down, ice it, and have that. Kombucha is fantastic. I love, love, love kombucha. And you can find kombucha elsewhere. I don't know about where you are, but certainly in Port Elizabeth you can find kombucha. In fact, a good friend of mine makes kombucha commercially, Janine Myberg. So she's got a brand of kombucha, and you find it in quite a few stores, I think. So if you want her details, let me know. I can always just give you a Facebook contact or something. And water kefir is another. Sorry?
Pick n Pay sells it.
Does it? Oh, okay.
Yes.
All right. Perfect.
Yeah.
You want to make sure there's no added sugar to it. But in general, kefir, I used to make 3 liters of it. I used to make 9 liters of it at a time because Cassie and I would just drink the stuff so rapidly. And typically, it's what's called a SCOBY, which is an acronym for select colony of bacteria and yeasts. So it looks like a pancake, but it's actually a plant, and it converts this mix that you make of black tea or green tea with sugar, literally a cup of sugar, and it converts it it ferments it into 2 acids, lactic acid and I can't remember the other acid, but very, very beneficial to liver health. So, and beautifully, lovely taste, really lovely taste. And water kefir, you can have milk kefir as well, but that's a thicker drinking yogurt. But water kefir is sensational. So it's like almost looks like, when you look at curds and whey, when you make cheese, and it's that the curds turns into curds, and then you I think you strain it, and the whey comes out of that. The curds it looks like curds, but it's a water-based plant. It grows in certain solutions. And often, so Jenny, down in the valley where there used to be a shop next to Evolution, a little farm stall, they sold like a ginger and lemon water kefir, which was absolutely fantastic tasting. So you could look out for that as well. Coffee is a brilliant drink. It's a very, very healthy drink. You can see it's got an amazing, amazing benefits. So I always think it's a really, really great one to bring in. Oh, and this concept of protecting the blood-brain barrier is important, because the disruption of the blood-brain barrier is implicated in neurological disorders like your Parkinson's disease. So you want to have that protection. So I always think coffee is a great one to bring in. But ideally, you want to buy organic coffee, and you want to buy from high altitudes, because low altitude coffee, what it means when the altitude is low, is that they tend to store the beans. And if it's low altitude, the chances of growing mold on those beans are much higher than at high altitudes. So I always used to buy, I think the Mastertons have an organic Honduras that I used to buy. So that was quite a nice one. And then tea stimulates, that's got lots of benefits as well. So it stimulates the metabolism. Oh, and I was going to say, actually, coffee is really great for drinking just before you train. Stimulates the release of fat. So I typically will have coffee before I train, every time on an empty stomach, because it just promotes fat use as fuel. Okay. Yes, so benefits to tea or green teas are your best or your most beneficial. I can't bear the taste of them. I find them absolutely revolting. And then oolong black. I don't know how people drink them. And oolong is not much better, actually. So I actually don't tend to drink tea these days. I might have a bit of rooibos, but... and then on to alcohol, which, of course, is a biggie. But, it's interesting because alcohol, it poses so many problems. I'm not suggesting you don't drink it. I think it's just best to keep it in you know, in small doses, as infrequently as one can, without feeling like your life is over. But it's just such strong links to cancer. You can see how many types of cancer. It damages the DNA, and that's where the cancer kind of issue seems to come from, because it results in the cell, you know, potentially just becoming out of control. Also impacts on neurotransmitters, so affects mood and stress. And we know that the impact on reducing serotonin is a depression state. So it's not, there's no real benefit to it except the taste. So I think you use it in the same way you would processed food, you know, have it knowing what the implications are, but have it because you enjoy the taste. And then just don't have it all the time. All right, so tips for managing alcohol. My suggestion is just go, because of the keto issue, we want to go on the lighter beer side or wine, which is relatively low in carbs, and then your liquors. If you can avoid drinking at home, obviously have some alcohol-free days, some non-free days if you do want to drink. Water in between is always a good idea, because as we age, we become much more sensitive. The liver becomes, it struggles to process as much. So water, we dehydrate more rapidly. It's always useful to eat something quite fatty, bit of protein before. So whether it's drivos or biltong or nuts or something. And then I would, you know, with my clients who have had real problems with booze, maybe capping, you know, if you're one of those people who knows that you can do a bottle in a night, I just can't. I can't do that. I mean, I've never really been a big drinker. It's maybe worth kind of having some sort of number. Else, no, I see you smiling.
If I have a bottle of wine, I'll sleep within an hour.
Yeah, so that's the sugar. Hits the bloodstream. I'm actually the same unless I eat something. Oh, it's terrible.
It's like a sleeping, one glass of white wine is like a sleeping pill.
Wow.
I want to go immediately to bed.
Oh, yeah. Really? Okay.
Ooh, yeah. Terrible.
Maybe not ideal. Okay. So moving on then to fats, I think we're okay on the drinks. There are enormous benefits to eating fat. Enormous. I'm not going to go through those. You'll have those in your notes. I just want to tell you about a 2009 study that was done. It looked at essential fatty acids in the human brain. And researchers said through the study, we've learned in recent years that fatty acids are among the most crucial molecules that determine your brain's integrity and ability to perform. So really, we do ourselves a disservice when we go low fat. And it's unfortunate that, you know, that was the mainstream advice for so long. Yeah. So our brains are comprised, I mean, they're huge amounts of fat. It's a very, very fatty tissue, and they use enormous amounts of fat. So that's problematic. You've got different types. You've got your saturated, which tend to be the harder fats at room temperature, like your butter and your coconut fat and the fat on meat. Polyunsaturated are your omega-3 and omega-6. And then monounsaturated are your seed oils, nut oils, avocado, and olive oils. Okay, so all fats contain a mix, but it depends how much of, like, they tend to be called by the predominance fat that they have in them, or the predominant type of fat they have in them. Okay, and they become fatty acids. So in the same way that carbohydrates become glucose, proteins become amino acids, and fats become fatty acids. Those are the most basic building blocks. Saturated fats, we know these days the research is very clear that they are exceptionally healthy and very beneficial to us, and that vegetable oils are in fact exceptionally unhealthy. In generally, those vegetable oils that are heat extracted, and we'll talk more about seed oils as well. Yeah, our cells are comprised of around 50% saturated fat. So, you know, that helps us keep everything in the cells and the structure of the cells intact. So we've got more benefits here. And a lovely study done in 2014 discovered that people who ate higher amounts of saturated fat did not experience more heart disease than those who ate less. So, it's just, have either of you girls read Nina Scholz's, is it Scholz? Nina, oh no, it's not Scholz. It's a much harder surname to pronounce. Her book on fat. What's it called? The Big Fat Lie, or she's an investigative journalist, but it's a fantastic book. It just talks about how we got onto, the political history, the politics behind how we ended up in a world of low fat. It's just according to the US and what it decided to do, and the whole world followed blindly. So very interesting.
Well, I think with grains and carbs as well.
Yeah, because it was all about subsidizing agriculture and what worked for them and what was cheapest. And so, hey, presto, we'll get someone to tell us that it's really unhealthy to eat saturated fat.
Yeah, and then we'll have the food pyramid and all the food groups. And I have to teach this direct in my subject.
Yeah, does that even happen? You see, this is my issue with I can't bear it. How long have we known now that the food pyramid is a waste of time?
Yeah.
And you still got to teach the damn thing.
I still teach it, but when I teach it and I say, but girls, watch the space. It's going to be turned upside down soon.
Yeah. It's exactly what I was going to say. You literally just flip it. Put fats at the top, protein in the middle, and carbs at the bottom. It's just it's mad. Although for some of your black learners and maybe even colored learners, they would be somewhere. So colored is more likely to be, the colored kind of genetic heritage is more likely to be somewhere in the middle of those two. Black is more likely to be able to manage carbohydrates more successfully, but not process carbohydrates. And whereas us whiteys, it's more, it's got to be turned exactly on its head. So it's seriously, this whole generic one fits all thing. It's also just so not right. Anyway, PUFAs, the polyunsaturated, you've got omega-3 and omega-6. So huge benefits to omega-3. I'm sure both of you have heard of omega-3s and maybe you've even seen some stuff around the benefits of them. These will be in your notes so you can have a wander through that. The thing about omega-3 is that my feeling is, unfortunately, you're both omnivores, so I don't have to have the debate with you about what kind of omega-3 you bring in, because your omega-3, marine-based omega-3 is far better than a plant-based omega-3, because there's a whole conversion process that has to occur. Most people they don't convert the plant version very well. And so it's much better to have the marine version because you will be able to utilize it very much faster and better and in higher quantities. So you can see huge numbers of even your grass-fed beef, as I said to you, is going to be high in omega-3, and your organ meats. That's another thing that you want to. We'll discuss that now with the proteins. And then your plant-based omega-3s, but frankly, as I say, with the two of you being omnivores, I wouldn't be looking at that. And then you've got omega-6. So there are some benefits to omega-6. Again, you can go through that. They're not typical oils. Evening primrose oil is one that a lot of especially ladies know, because it's often bought in for I'm trying to think if it's issues around menstruation or menopause. There's evening primrose oils, and I will, that may pop up later with things like supplements. But so that's your omega-6. But having said, you've got these two groups, but omega-3, what omega-3 tends to do is it suppresses overactive immunity, okay? Whereas your omega-6 is more pro-inflammatory. So omega-3 sort of dampens the inflammation in the body. So it sort of softens this overexuberant kind of immune system reaction to certain things. But omega-6 promotes an inflammatory response. So you need a combination of the two in the diet to sort of keep your immune system revving, but not in overdrive. You want it switched on, but not excessively so. And your ratio should really be 2 to 1 in terms of 6 to 3, okay? But actually in the modern so-called Western diet, we're looking at more like 10 to 1 or 20 to 1, which is vastly, vastly out of what's ideal. So we want to bring, it's likely that if you are eating some junk every now and then, you're going to want omega-3s in, but you're not necessarily going to supplement with omega-6. Okay. So you've got sources of omega-3 there, but personally, I'll take on the days. Actually, the way I do this is I take an omega-3 supplement typically on the days where I might bring in something processed, because I'll know that process will have something omega-6 in it, and so the omega-3 will just counter that. But I don't necessarily have omega-3s every single day.
Tanya?
Yes.
Isn't it easier to just drink the pills, omega-6 and omega-3, and then I don't have to worry?
No, so I'm saying don't take omega-3, omega-6. I don't think it's beneficial to take omega-6 unless you have an exceptionally healthy diet. Well, there's no reason to bring in a pro-inflammatory oil, because it's likely that at some point through your day, you're going to be eating some sort of, or through your week, you might be eating some kind of crap. I mean, I had even this gluten-free bread I've got, it's a processed bread. It's going to have some omega-6 in it. So I would take omega-3 on that day to counter the omega-6, but I wouldn't take an omega-6 supplement personally. Okay. Yeah. Okay. And I would only take an omega-3. Look, you'd have to make your own decisions about what supplements you'll take, and we'll cover supplements to some degree. But for me, omega-3 I take to counter omega-6. I don't take it outside of that. So if I've got an exceptionally healthy day food-wise, I don't generally bring in an omega-3, as I've said. But yes, but it's always useful to bring the foods in that contain, you always rather want to go with a real food than a supplement. So never ever go first choice supplement. Always go first choice real food. Always. Okay. And naturally your pastured animals always have a better ratio of the two, because that's their natural food stuff. Okay. Let's see if there's anything else. No. All right, monounsaturated fat. Yeah, I mean, we don't you've got your olive oil here, almonds, cashews, pecans. You can see all the other oils and foods that these monounsaturated fats come in. And there are some benefits here as well. But in terms of best fats to use, the way that I would do this is I would bring in a range. I always suggest a range. Actually, my range is typically olive oil, butter, coconut fat. Those are the three basics that I tend to use. You could bring in MCT oil, which is actually just an extract from coconut fat. It's a medium chain triglyceride oil. It's got no taste, no flavor really. So it's quite useful for adding to things if you don't want to taste fat. Seed oils are problematic, so I would never suggest bringing seed oils in. The only time that I tend to bring seed oil is if someone is in gastric distress, or they have a very sensitive gut and they have a lot of bloating or inflammation. I would bring in flaxseed oil in fairly high doses for maybe the first 3 to 4 weeks, because that settles the gut beautifully. It seems to have a very, very nice effect on the gut. And it's a lovely tasting oil, but I would always go with an exceptionally high quality oil that's been cold pressed and extracted without exposure to oxygen. So it must always be in a dark glass bottle, and I would always keep that in the freezer. So you screw up immediately, put it back in the freezer, so you eliminate the oxygen, because oxygen will make it rancid, light will make it rancid. They're very, very, very unstable oils, which is why we don't recommend them for adding to foods. avoid those awful canola, rapeseed, corn, soybean, grapeseed, all of those. Just avoid them. And your trans fatty acids too. So like I don't think anyone's eating margarine these days. Yeah, so cook with your olive oils, your butter, your coconut fat, rendered oil. So I always keep my fat from my chicken, my roast chicken, or anything else that I might roast. Keep that fat, cook in it. It's lovely stuff. You can buy goose fat, you can buy duck fat in store. I wouldn't tend to buy, I'm a little bit wary of buying commercial saturated fats just because, unless they're organic, just because they'll be mass produced. Like lard, you can get blocks of lard in store, and that's pork fat. So that's likely to come from concentrated, steroided, medicated pigs. Cold pressed liquid oils you could use over salads. You can actually put them into hot food. You just can't cook with them. So if you were to pour some flax oil into flax, if you had a gut issue, you could pour them into something hot like a soup or something, and they won't get damaged, but you can't cook with them. That's just too high temperature. And yeah, eat a range in generous quantities. Okay, any questions on that before we go to proteins?
Yes.
Okay.
If you can't use, say if I want to make potatoes in oil for the family,
yeah, then
I'm not going to use sunflower, but what oil can I use then?
Use coconut fat. So you could just shallow fry. So just keep you cut your potatoes very thin and then shallow fry them in oil, because it's going to be expensive. So you might want to just get just get a pan with a fair amount of oil in it. If you were going to, that's what I would do, but obviously that's costly. If you were, look, to be fair, and a heat extracted sunflower oil, it's already rancid by the time you're going to cook it, but it's a whole lot better than going to a takeout joint and using oil that's been used 30 times already, and that is just jam-packed with carcinogenic compounds, which I'll have every now and then. I like a good chip that's been fried in someone else's oil. I have no problem with but just not very often. So your sunflower oil might be a better bet in that instance, but coconut fat would be even better. Okay. All right. So moving on to protein. And this is going to be Elsner's favorite part, because you like your meat, and so do I, actually. I love it. So we are talking proteins. We are essentially a protein in one. It's required for everything in terms of growth, maintenance. Practically everything you see is protein based, including hormones. So our behavior is very related to, as I said last night, hormones. Hormones are proteins. So everything that we consume is, going to express itself in some way. So it's always interesting when, I've had conversations in the past with certain mainstream medical practitioners, should we say, and when I've spoken diet, they've sort of glazed over and gone, well, there's no proof that diet makes any difference to health. And you're like, oh? How do you even get there? How is it not logical? Anyway. So, but I suspect it's a rare mindset, but I have come across it many times. So, okay, the protein thing is there's some degree of controversy around it, although it's not really a heavily controversial subject. But this idea of what's called the mTOR pathway, which is a signaling pathway responsible for growth and repair. There were or are concerns about high levels of protein causing stimulation or activation of that pathway and then resulting in cancers. But as well as protein being able to stimulate that pathway, so can insulin. And insulin activates it in a far more damaging way than protein does. Protein has a very quick reaction or quick activation of the mTOR pathway. It lasts a very short period. Whereas insulin actually activates that pathway for a much longer time frame. So it would be worth your idea of, this keeping blood sugar levels down would be a much better bet than worrying about protein. And neither of you, it's not like it's typical with things like your bodybuilders where they tend to they're basically just eating meat all the time, eating protein all the time. And that might be more of a consideration. But that's not you. It's not me. I don't think we need to worry too much about protein and over-consuming it. But I just think it's quite an interesting thing to observe, because protein does tend to get linked to this idea of, excess causes cancer, and it's not necessarily, it's insulin that's the problem all round in the human body, actually, when it's produced excessively. Okay, so how much protein? That's the other thing that we've got to think about, because, I get asked that question a lot. The two of you are quite active, so you're looking at up to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. But your actual content of protein is much lower than the weight of the food, so you need to be aware of that. And also how you cook your food will lower the content of protein as well, the value of content. So look at this, 100 degrees, cook meat at 100 degrees, you lose 40%. Cook it at 140, you lose 80%. I mean, that's just mad. So it could be that you're actually cooking a lot of your protein value away. So slow and low is a much better bet. So you're poaching or you're stewing, for example. And you can see here some of the estimated protein values, 100 grams of whether lamb, chicken, beef, you're only looking at around about 25 to 30%, maybe just over 30%. So it's quite low. So in other words, a 300-gram steak is only going to give you around about, or a 100-gram steak is only going to give you around 30 grams, 35 grams of protein. So, so you can bring in a fair amount. Boiled egg is about 6 grams. And it might be worth your while looking, on most of your foods that you'll buy, like most of your packaging, it should tell you how many grams of protein there are in the food stuff. And that's quite useful to sort of start thinking about whether you're bringing enough in according to what your needs are. You've got two sources, obviously animal and plant proteins. So animal proteins are your complete proteins. They supply all of the 9 essential amino acids that the body needs but can't produce itself. Okay, so you want those essential amino acids. They are essential. Plant proteins don't provide those, except in the case of the chia seeds, hemp seeds, quinoa, farro, buckwheat, and spirulina. Those are complete. No other plant protein is complete. And so this is where this argument, the sort of vegan, because vegetarians are typically more likely to bring in dairy, whereas vegans won't do that. And so this is an important thing to note, is the need for these essential amino acids. All right, so let's go into a bit of detail around this. We're nearly done. Animal proteins, better grown in their natural state, better eaten if they're grown in their natural state, because they have a better nutritional value, as we've said. So if they're pastured, that's great. You want it wild for seafood, organic for land animals, organic grass-fed for cattle and sheep. Okay, try and include the organs. The organs are amazing. And those are what we used to eat. That's what we used to prize. If you ever go to an abattoir, you'll find those organs go first. I mean, they're prized, by guys doing the actual cutting, and typically your average laborer is going to take the organ meats first. They're very, very protein rich, very fat rich, very, very healthy. Yogurt and cheese, as I've said before, they offer moderate to high levels of protein depending on which you choose. Eggs are moderate levels of protein, so they're perfectly nice to bring in. I love eggs. Always organic, always. Because again, you've got this imbalance otherwise in conventional eggs, which are then pro-inflammatory. So there's no good bringing eggs in, because eggs are healthy if they are high in omega-6 and cause inflammation. There's no such thing as just, it's kind of like, it's what annoys me about, and I don't mean to, I'm not just dissing vegans per se, but often the argument is, they will say all meat eaters, it's as if we're all eating McDonald's. Now, I wouldn't touch McDonald's. I don't touch fast food meat. I eat something that is generally incredibly ethically raised, pastured, organic, and that is a very different animal to something that's put through high stress, feedlot farmed, medicated, heavily medicated, fed foods that are an abomination. It's different, completely different product. So I really it irritates me, this idea that, there's like one, it's like your food pyramid, there's no one answer to the question. So, okay, bear in mind with eggs, they are incredibly healthy, but how you cook them is going to impact. So the greater the surface area you expose to high temperatures, the more damaged the egg will become. So boil, poach, or raw is best. And then you've got your fried, and if you're frying, do sunny side up so that you're not turning it over and then frying the other side. But, if you have a fried egg, omelette, scrambled egg every now and then, that's also not going to kill you. It's just not your healthiest option. Okay.
And is it okay to have eggs every day? That's not a problem.
Yeah. So the issue, Jenny, where they just, again, just to say, oh, all eggs are bad. Well, no, actually, the eggs that are damaged are bad. So firstly, if it's a commercial cage battery-raised egg, then I wouldn't touch it. And secondly, if you're going to fry it every day, or omelette or scrambled every day, then yes, you're going to have a problem because you've damaged the fat. But otherwise, no. I mean, I always love to keep, a bowl of boiled eggs in the fridge. I mean, they're the most brilliant snack. Honestly, absolutely love them. Look, no food you should eat every single day because you can cause problems. You can cause intolerances. So you don't want to eat the same food every day, but certainly it's not a problem from a point of view of health in that sense. Plant proteins, why go there if you don't need to? Maybe nuts. Legumes and lentils, I suppose, if you really like the taste, they can be nice for variety. Just bear in mind they're relatively high in fat, in carbs. And also just that little note at the bottom, peanuts are legumes, not nuts, because everyone loves peanut butter and peanuts, but they are actually legumes, which means they're high in carbs. So just keep that in mind. Actually, in the case of cashew nuts and peanuts, which are both legumes, actually cashews don't have as much fat in them, but peanuts have, they have fair amount of fat in them. I rather like my peanut butter, and I will have it, but I just don't eat huge amounts of it. And then I think this is one of our last slides. Soy is one of those things. I don't know if either of you are eating any soy, but okay, all right. So just to say a very quick note, when it's traditionally fermented, it's beautiful stuff. It has a host of benefits. And your typically fermented foods are going to be like your misos, tempeh, and soy sauce, natto. Those are traditionally fermented. So that's how the East would eat soy, is in a fermented form. They don't eat it in a non-fermented form. That's the West that's done that. And there are literally thousands of studies linking it to our commercial products are not fermented, and it's linked to malnutrition, digestive distress, immune system breakdown. I mean, you name it. Thyroid issues, reproductive issues, cancers, heart disease. It's just, I don't recommend soy ever unless it's a fermented type. So, I'm not even going to go through. I had a long note here, but it's in your notes. You'll see all the other issues related to soy. I see that we're on time now. We must just finish. Okay, last slide, dairy alternatives. And again, I don't think you girls are avoiding dairy, or are either of you just, okay.
I don't really do dairy.
Yeah, me neither.
And milk in my coffee.
Okay. So look, this might be quite useful information because, again, the vegan movement is pushing dairy alternatives. The problem is they're incredibly environmentally damaging, a lot of them. I mean, from coconut destroying tropical, forests, almond trees destroying commercial bees in huge quantities, rice milk being a massive pollutant, environmental pollutant, huge amounts of water required. Looks like hazelnut for me is the best bet because it's the most environmentally stable, reduces greenhouse emissions, it's wind pollinated, it's in climates, where there isn't water shortage. So these are, and these are things that we've got to take into mind. It's all very well berating animal eaters for all this, the McDonald's effect, which is all the feedlot farming and the destruction of, the Amazon forest and, where they clear swathes for this intensive farming. You take your average permaculture farm or well kind of thought through ethical farmer who puts his farm together, he's got a great thing going versus either one of the extreme, which is the vegan kind of alternate to milk, which is causing absolute mayhem, and the feedlot intensive farming, which is causing mayhem. So, it's maybe something just to think about. But yeah, so that covers the nutritional guidelines. And as I say, I'm going to send you the notes. It's a big topic. And there are one or two things we haven't covered here, like gliadin and gluten intolerances, which are in your notes. Everything's in much more detail. So you can have a read through those and see if there's anything you want to ask about. But hopefully, Elsner, do you feel a little bit more settled about where these macronutrients fit in now?